Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Expats in Ukraine with your host, me, Corey. Today my guest, he is British-Lebanese. He is a war correspondent and award-winning documentary filmmaker. His name is Oz Katerji. Oz, how are you, man?
Thanks very much for having me on.
No, it's great to have you on, man. After I talked to my lawyer, he recommended that you come onto the podcast because you're such an interesting guy. I looked through all your stuff and Battle for Kyiv, man. I can't wait to see the full-length documentary. I just saw the trailer and I was in love, man.
Yeah, so I filmed that during the first opening weeks of the war in Ukraine. It'll be released at some point later this year, hopefully. So yeah, it's been a struggle because my first proper film. So it's been a struggle trying to learn the ropes of the industry and get it published. But yeah, it won a couple of awards at some film festivals, so it's done pretty well, and I'm looking forward to releasing it so everyone can watch it. As I said, it was filmed by me for the first 3 months I was here. Arrived just before the war began on February 14th, Valentine's Day 2022. I arrived in Kiev, and I just got to work, filming every day that I went out. So the documentary sort of tells the story of your lawyer's one of the characters in it, Vyacheslav Yurash. He's an MP in Zelensky's Servant to the People Party. He's the youngest parliamentarian in Ukraine's history. And I met him on day 2 of the war. Day 2 of the war, I met him. He was outside, not far from the apartment I was renting. And he'd taken his boys, including Yuri, your lawyer, and they were outside the police station picking up rifles. That was an odd thing to see. Obviously, Sviatoslav, if you've seen him, if you watch the documentary, he kind of stands out. He's very, very tall, and he wears this long black trench coat. So he was wearing this trench coat, this tall guy with a Vyshyvanka on, holding an AK-47, and that stands out to you, obviously. So I went up to him and said, "Hey, who are you? My name's Oz, I'm a filmmaker." He explained he was an MP and that he was with his boys and they were picking up weapons to defend their capital. And from that moment, I was like, right, can I film you? Can I go with you places? And effectively, that's what started the process of making the documentary, traveling around Kyiv with Sviatoslav and his men, as they tried to deliver aid, as they went to front lines. And it tells the story of what happened. I mean, obviously, I wasn't everywhere in Kyiv, so it's not one of those documentaries that interviews a bunch of people that weren't with me. It follows the characters through their eyes. So it's the story of the battle for Kyiv told from the perspective of a few young Ukrainians with my camera, told from, an on-the-ground, boots-on-the-ground perspective of how those early weeks in Ukraine unfolded. And I think it's very relevant to what's happening today. The reason is that by not falling, Ukraine sets the stage for the rest of the war from this point onwards. And while a lot of the talk at the moment is about diplomatic concessions, something I strongly disagree that Ukraine should do. I don't think Ukraine should concede a single inch of their territory. I think that would be a disaster. But saying that, even if that situation were to happen, it's still in some ways a victory for Ukraine because they managed to defeat Russia and Kyiv. They managed to defend their territory, defend their nation state. Ukraine still exists as a sovereign nation state because of what happened in Kyiv. So I think it's a really important testimony of what happened here in Ukraine. And so far, we're the only English language feature-length documentary about the battle for Kyiv. So hopefully it stands as a test of time and documents history for many years to come.
Oh yeah. I mean, I would love to see it, first of all. But when I was watching the documentary, I was I just felt so much emotion when I was watching it that I had my girlfriend also watch the trailer, so I watched it twice. just so she can, see it and have this emotion. Because I was here in Ukraine as well during the full scale invasion. Right before the full scale invasion, I went to Western Ukraine because I understood that something may happen. But watching all of this, and you were actually there, we'll talk about this in just like a moment, what you experienced, what you saw when you were in cities like, Irpin and Bucha. But first, I want to ask, what was your journey to Ukraine? Why did you end up in Ukraine on February 14th, 2022? I know you were doing some stuff in Syria, right?
Yeah, so actually those two questions tie into one. What was I doing in Ukraine? I'm a war correspondent by trade. I've been a war journalist for basically my entire... the first thing I did when I left university is start an internship at an English language newspaper in Beirut. So I started covering low-level conflicts in Lebanon, and then obviously the Arab Spring, which kicked off shortly afterwards. So I started at the beginning of my career covering conflict, and that was something that I always wanted to do. So my uncle was he was a producer for the BBC, but he was reporting from Beirut at one point, and I was very young, maybe 5 or 6, when I first saw my uncle on my mum's side, so the British side, reporting from Beirut, with the gear on and stuff. Yeah. So, when some children grow up, they want to be magicians or sports stars or whatever they want to be. For me, the first kind of career path that I envisaged for myself was war journalist, watching my uncle, and it kind of, so I think a lot of young people, they grow up and they don't necessarily know what they want to do with their life at 16, 17. That was never something that I had to worry about because I always had one pursuit, one goal. I wanted to get into war journalism, and my life was kind of just one long process into that. So then the Arab Spring started. Really, my interest before all of this was the Lebanese civil war because it impacted my family directly, and the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Those were the two subjects that I most focused on. And really, if you'd have asked me, where do I think I see myself, I probably would have been a Palestine-focused journalist. However, the Arab Spring kicked off, Syria started happening, and that was massively undercovered, in my opinion, at the time when it started. So, I got involved in covering Syria. I kind of blended, human rights activism with my journalism. I don't think that's that uncommon. Lots of journalists do that, but it also draws criticism from people who believe that journalists should be, supremely neutral on everything. That's not something I agree with as a journalist. In fact, I don't think any journalists are neutral. I would argue that the very fact that you decided to become a journalist and to cover politics and war means that you have opinions on these things. Otherwise, you wouldn't have chosen to do that. So I think the idea of journalistic neutrality is a myth. The way I see it is journalists have to be objective about the truth that they're reporting, not neutral. I don't think anyone can look at, a dictatorship brutalizing and murdering civilians and be neutral on that. That is not something as a human being that you can be neutral on. In fact, neutrality in that situation puts you on the side of the aggressor. So started covering Syria, and then Syria introduced me to Russian foreign policy, which was something that I hadn't spent much of my time in my life covering or researching. Obviously I learned about the Soviet Union and things like that, but the modern state of Russia and their foreign policy wasn't something that had crept into my purview at any point, because I've mostly been covering the United States, the Iraq War, Palestine. So Russia had very little involvement with these things, but the Russian involvement in Syria really started to make me pay attention to. It wasn't something I sought out in my career to start covering Russian aggression. Anyway, over the course of many, many years, I started to become, quite well read on the subject. And then obviously the invasion of Crimea and the east of Ukraine happened. So suddenly Russia was no longer something that I wasn't familiar with. It became very quickly the main focus of my career because, while covering what was happening in Syria was taking up the most of my time, the reason why Syria was in the position that it was Russia was its patron. It was intervening to defend it. Iran alone couldn't have prevented the collapse of the Assad regime, and it became Russia, and then Russia's designs in Europe. Its advances in Europe, its funding of the far right in Europe and abroad, made me concentrate a lot on what Russia was doing. And then, so years advanced, and you know, I went from being a rookie journalist to a veteran journalist. And when the second invasion of Ukraine looked imminent, I was one of the journalists who read the signs early and was warning that this was coming. As far back as November, December 2021, I became convinced that Russia was about to invade Ukraine.
What convinced you, by the way?
I want to say it was the open source work that I was doing, you know, tracking Russian troop movements on satellite imagery and so on. But I think it was something more more gut feeling than that. It was having covered Syria for so many years, having seen what the Russians were prepared to do. Russia was not this kind of former great power that was trying to assert its influence and really was just concerned about its own security, and NATO was over. This was coming from lots of very serious intellectuals, very serious Russia analysts who seemed to think this. For me, Russia was a fascist dictatorship that was hell-bent on reviving its territorial expansionist aims. This seemed clear as day to me. So maybe seeing the troop movements and stuff was just confirming my biases, but my biases were ultimately proven correct. And the people that said Putin wouldn't do this, Putin's a, you know, canny operator, I think I would say that my understanding of fascism, my understanding of the threat posed by fascism, led me to believe that what was happening in Russia was a fascist dictatorship that was going to start the largest war in Europe since the Second World War. And I think a lot of people lulled themselves into a false sense of security that this was never going to happen. So for me, it was clear what was happening. So I mean, by the time February, it reached February, I was like, this is imminent. You know, the Biden administration was warning that this was imminent. A lot of people were dismissing those warnings. But while a lot of people were busy talking, I was packing my bags and heading for Ukraine because I knew, I was certain, like maybe there was like a 1% in my mind that maybe this wouldn't happen, but I was certain not only would they invade Ukraine again, but they would invade Kyiv. I remember having some arguments with some journalists in that first week I was in Ukraine who were convinced, they thought that Russia was going to do something, but they were convinced it was going to be isolated to the east. So they were making trips to go to Donetsk at the time. And I was like, stay here. This is where it's going to happen. So I remember getting into some disputes with people about that. Again, I wish I'd been proven wrong, because what happened here was an absolute catastrophe. It's a disaster for the Ukrainian people. They've lost so many of their young, of the next generation. It's a tragedy. I wish I was wrong, but I wasn't wrong. And I was convinced that the war was going to come. So while a lot of people were heading other places, I was flying into Kiev. And again, the next question following on, why did you stay? Why didn't you leave when so many people evacuated? Well, because I knew I thought the invasion was coming. So why would I leave when I was proven right? Yeah. I'd prepared to come to Ukraine and cover the war, the invasion of Kyiv, for as long as it took. Luckily, thankfully, thanks to the sacrifice and bravery and defiance of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian men and women who put their lives on the line to defend Kyiv, the occupation only lasted 38 days, and it wasn't a long trip that I had to make. I was able to stay for a few months and then leave.
I mean, to me, this would be, because I was living in Kyiv at the time, but I went to Western Ukraine shortly before the Russians invaded Kyiv. Like, isn't this concerning for you? Before the invasion, everyone thought Russia had the second strongest military, and they were predicting that Kyiv would fall in like what, 2 days to a week or something like this. And you put yourself right in the middle of that threat.
Yes.
And weren't you concerned, or were you more interested in telling the story about what's going on with this invasion? Didn't this like?
I mean,
worry
look,
you?
it's a difficult question to ask because I don't want to pretend like I don't have any interest in self-preservation or my own safety. It's just not my primary concern. You know, obviously I don't want to die or be captured, which for me is worse, probably. Obviously I was concerned that that might happen, but the bigger concern for me was I found myself in a moment in history that many people were dismissing. And the most important thing was the defense of Kyiv, the drawing a line in the sand and saying this far, no further. The Russians must be stopped. And the worry for me was that if everyone left, who would be left to tell the story? I mean, again, it's easier to say in hindsight because the Ukrainians were victorious in Kyiv, but they might not have been. When I was booking where I wanted to stay, I booked an Airbnb right next to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry and the British Embassy, and it's in between two hotels where the international press were staying. You know, the cheaper one and the more expensive one. So I realized before the war began, if the Russians were going to take Kyiv, they'd have to occupy the government areas.
Yeah, of course.
So they'd have to occupy the street that I was on. So from the outset, my intention was, if Kyiv falls, I'm going to be here when it falls, and I'm going to continue reporting if it has fallen, no matter the risk to my personal safety. Again, it wasn't some act of sacrifice or heroism. It was understanding that this moment in history was much bigger than me, much bigger than my than what my life was worth, and that without reporters reporting on these things, people would have been left to die in silence. And again, I don't want to say that I was the only one doing that. There were many others who made that same decision. I can only explain it from my perspective. And my perspective was that this story was more important than my personal safety. And I think when you look at something like what's happening in Gaza over the last year and a half, obviously the sacrifice and bravery of Palestinian journalists needs to be raised as the most important point. They are the eyes of the world telling the story, but they also get dismissed because they're Gazan Palestinian, in the same way that Ukrainian journalists are often dismissed, or the same way that, you know, Sudanese journalists are often dismissed. The reason the international press exists is people want verification from their own reporters. And you can say, oh, well, I don't like how that is. We should just trust Ukrainian journalists or trust Palestine. I agree we should, but that's not the way the world works. And the international press has a role to play in telling these stories, in verifying these stories. And I recognize my role. It's a small role. I'm not some huge, you know, multi-award winning journalist. I know I'm, you know.
Well, you did win multiple awards.
I mean, for my film, those are the first awards I've won at some, you know, smallish film festivals. I'm very grateful for those films. It's the start of my, you know, I'm still young. I'm still in my 30s. So, you know, as far as war journalists go, I'm still early in my career, even though I've been in the job for 15 years. At the end of the day, the international press has a role to play. And I felt that was vitally important for what was happening in Ukraine. And also, look, it needs to be pointed out, and I'm not insulting or attacking any of my colleagues that did this. For the most part, this was the security teams that they were with that were instructing them to do this. But many of my colleagues left Ukraine on the 24th of February, or left Kyiv rather, and moved to Western Ukraine for fear of their own safety. It's totally understandable. Had I had children or, something like that, that might have made me feel differently about the decision that I made. But it kind of made it all the more important when other journalists are fleeing. You kind of have to stay, because if you don't stay, who does? So there was no doubt in my mind that I was going to stay no matter what happened, even if Kiev had fallen.
Can you go over your day then on the 24th? So you woke up in the morning, they invaded. What was your day like?
I went to Maidan Square and I started broadcasting my thoughts, but a curfew was imposed pretty quickly because there were saboteurs, assassination squads. The Russians had active measures on the ground trying to facilitate their entry into Kyiv. So the first 48 hours or so was spent as confused as everyone else. I was mostly locked in my apartment watching the news unfold on the news rather than reporting it, because I wasn't in a position to report it. So
were you working with any agency or media company at the time?
So I've been freelance for the majority of my career, and I prefer it. I've worked for companies before, but being freelance gives me the opportunity to work for lots of people at the same time. So really, my phone was never not ringing through those first few weeks, because so few people in the end had people on the ground, which left a handful of freelance journalists, myself, John Sweeney, some others, on the ground, ending up picking up all of these freelance commissions because there were so few other journalists available to take them. And many of the journalists that stayed had security teams, big companies, CNN, BBC, who aren't going to do, freelance commissions throughout their day because they're busy reporting elsewhere. So yeah, being freelance in that particular moment was very, very useful for me, because it meant that I was able to do a lot of work. And I ended up getting my voice out there quite a lot, which was helpful for my career. But again, it wasn't the intention behind anything that I was doing. The importance was the story of what was happening in Kyiv, and what the Ukrainian people were doing to defend their homes.
When did you realize that you wanted to do a documentary? Because like you said, you're a journalist. This is your first, I guess, go at documentary filmmaking. When did you realize that you wanted to do a documentary about what was happening in Kyiv?
So it's not my first go at filmmaking or documentaries. I have released some for Vice News in the past, and I've done, news packages for ITN, for Sky News. So I've done a lot, NBC as well. I've done a lot of production work, but this is my first time as a director.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't my first time in front of camera, because I've done on-screen documentaries for Vice as well. But it was the first time that I was doing something on my own, which wasn't for Sky or Vice or someone, large that were paying for everything. And I was effectively producing for a large team. But early in my career, I was mostly interested in being a writer. But in my early 20s, I kind of made a pivot into broadcast. It wasn't an intentional one. It was more like there was a decline in the media industry that started around the early 2000s. There was less money coming into the industry. Journalists were being paid less. Outlets were closing down. And this only got worse and worse and worse. There was more money and more opportunities in TV and broadcast. So I found myself, pivoting into that through Vice as the kind of thing that helped me get the ball rolling. Because I had no technical skills with editing or camera work or anything at the time. So I started to pick that stuff up. After doing documentaries for Vice, I became confident using a camera, but I hadn't had the opportunity to do anything between then. So I was mostly doing production for TV channels like Sky, NBC, and I was enjoying that. It was good, but I kind of had in my mind that I haven't done my own feature-length documentary before. It would be good to, I always had in the back of mind, I'd like to do that at some point. I got into podcasting as well, so I was starting to get comfortable being a solo kind of media producer. But I didn't really come to Ukraine with the intention necessarily of making a documentary. I more just took my camera with me everywhere that I went. And if you look back at my work from those first few weeks in Kyiv, it was mostly writing and radio and, you know, mostly reporting. However, as I was writing and doing all that reporting, I also had my camera with me. And, you know, some people who have quite pro-Russian viewpoints would routinely accuse me of, oh, he's lying, he's making that up, he didn't go here, he didn't see that. That's par for the course if you report in this modern day and age. But also, throughout that whole time, I was recording everything. So I was like, well, we'll see at the end of this who was lying or not. But then the process of turning all of that footage into a feature-length documentary was a total new journey for me. Working, you know, on a 10-minute film, a 15-minute film with a team of, you know, 5-10 other people is a very, very different experience from making a 60-minute film all on your own, just you and an editor. The editor didn't come on board until a year later when I was trying to drum up fun. Again, to get a film made, it costs money, like a lot of money. You have to pay an editor or do it yourself. And although I can edit, I didn't have confidence in my ability to edit a feature-length film, because it's like, you know, I write articles, but I haven't written a novel yet. I will write a novel or a book one day, I suppose, but the difference between writing something that's 2,000 words long and 80,000 words long is huge. Just as the difference between editing a 2.5-minute video is and a 60-minute video is huge. So I really wanted some input, and filmmaking is a collaborative process. So look, getting the film made, filming the film was very dangerous, nearly got me killed. And I spent 3 months doing it.
A big part of your film takes place like in Bucha and Irpin.
Yes.
You uncovered a lot of these atrocities.
Yes.
Did you think the Russians were capable of that?
100%. Not only did I think that the Russians were capable of that, I knew the Russians would do that, because that's what the Russians did in Syria. They bomb hospitals, schools, playgrounds. They murder children as a routine. They do that. That's their modus operandi. That they're not just accidentally killing children. They are killing children as a priority, because by killing children, they spread fear and terror among the population they're trying to oppress.
And so what you're saying is they're getting the soldiers are getting like orders from, you know, higher up to just kill civilians?
I mean, I think so, yes. Yes. One of the stories that I covered for Sky News was we proved that the Russians had bombed the market, killing more than 40 civilians in Idlib. Now, we proved this using open source methods, but we also had audio from the Russian pilots themselves that was being recorded on the ground by some contacts that we'd made. So they were recording the conversations between the air control towers and the Russian pilots. And the Russian pilots were confirming the hits as they were doing them. And we had all of this in real time.
Wow.
And the audio of all of this. And one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard in my life is the Russians would say that they were delivering candy, delivering sweets. And once they'd finished bombing the market, the Russian pilots would say the candy has been delivered. This was certain. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate. This was systematic. This was targeting civilians. And the Russians knew what they were doing, and they were, you know, that they did it. They murdered people. Then they lied about it. No, we didn't do that. And then they blamed the victims for bombing themselves. And that's what they were doing throughout the war in Syria. So I had no doubt that they would start doing that in Ukraine. And we saw that immediately with the children's who were sheltering in that theater in Mariupol with big letters written outside, children here, right? And the Russians bombed it. And then when the Russians bombed it, killing, we still don't know how many hundreds died in that. We believe hundreds died. Children, hundreds of children died in that attack. The Russians then blamed the Ukrainians for bombing that building, which is what they do. Yeah. They slaughter with impunity, and then they blame the victims. So yeah, I did think the Russians would do that. And again, that was part of the reason why I came and I stayed, because I knew we were about to witness the most horrifying events in Europe since the Second World War. And I've been proven correct on those. Again, I wish I'd been proven wrong, but unfortunately I wasn't. So
Can you talk about what you saw, like in Bucha and Irpin, like all these war
Sure.
crimes? I had, people on the podcast, talk about it before, and I'm always shocked and amazed of the cruelty that the Russians were capable of.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, it goes back to the film. I learned filmmaking, and I didn't necessarily have a plan in mind to start filming a documentary when I got to Kyiv, but I took my camera everywhere with me. And again, that 2-year process of making the film was like climbing a mountain, and it was a real learning process for me. Part of that was obviously the filming process was the most important, and I was under a lot of attack online at the time from people because I was so explicitly defensive of the Ukrainians, which for some people saw as crossing a line in journalism. And because of those attacks, I wanted to get closer and closer and closer because I wanted to show what was happening. I wanted to prove what was happening. That unfortunately led me to take greater and greater risks with my safety, which meant getting as close to Irpin and Bucha as we possibly could. And one of the things that happens in my film, and you'll be able to see when it's released later this year, is we get caught by Russians. We actually get to a Russian checkpoint, and we get caught by Russians. So one of the main images that was broadcast around the world in Irpin was the bridge, the collapsed bridge, and the civilians streaming out of Irpin. And, journalists who crossed the bridge were killed, trying to report that story. And because the bridge was broken, you couldn't get a car across it or whatever. I thought, well, let's try and go around. Let's try and go round into Irpin via another route, which is what we decided to do, me and a group of other journalists. This was the day that the Russians had that humanitarian corridor open. You don't trust Russian humanitarian corridors, for one thing. Anyway, so we went round and we thought the road that we were on was clear. And we met some Ukrainian militiamen along the way who were like, look, there's Russians down there and down there. But this road, it's clear up until, a few hundred meters, and there's a final Ukrainian checkpoint. And then the Russians are beyond that. So we took what those Ukrainian guys had said seriously. And we kept driving up that road, and we got to the first checkpoint, and we assumed it was Ukrainian. So it was friendly. We're like, oh, hi guys, whatever. As you have been at every Ukraine, we'd had to travel past 12, 13 checkpoints to get to Irpin at that point. And then slowly we realized that these guys were not Ukrainian, they were Russians. And that was alarming, to say the least. I honestly didn't think I would walk out of there alive.
Wow.
And the last message I sent to my uncle, who was the war journalist, formerly a war journalist, now a lawyer. And he was coordinating he was my point of contact back home should anything happen. The last message I sent him was "Stop by Russians." That was
Wow.
That was it. And 8 minutes later, we managed to get away, and I was like, "We're away." So those would have been my last words had I died. And look, the Russians were executing journalists. Max Levine was clearly executed by Russians, Ukrainian journalist, in the opening days of the war. For some reason, the Russians radioed their superiors, and their superiors said, "Tell them to get out of here, or we'll shoot them." So
Wow.
we
got lucky, man.
we got lucky. We got lucky. But that was the point. That was the situation that we were heading towards. We were constantly trying to get. Some of those days that we tried to film were just spent 3 hours trying to get to a location, getting told by the men it's too dangerous, you can't go, getting sent back home. As a filmmaker, that was immensely frustrating. As a writer, as a broadcaster on radio, whatever, those weren't lost days because I could report what I saw along the way.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're making a film, if you don't get to where you're trying to get to, that's a wasted day as you see it. So I was constantly trying to juggle that, like not seeing what I wanted to see and constantly making ever more decisions that were, in hindsight now, quite risky decisions because I was desperate to show what was happening. As the war progressed, we started to get closer and closer and closer. And as we got closer, we started seeing more evidence of crimes. In Irpin, we saw dead civilians lying on the streets. In Bucha, so we got into Bucha, I believe it was about 36 hours after the Ukrainian military got into Bucha, maybe 48 hours. So we weren't in the first echelon of people that were coming in, but we were in we were amongst the first journalists that managed to make it in there. And the crimes were obvious. They were everywhere you looked. There were still people dead on the streets that the Ukrainians hadn't had the time to remove the bodies. And the mass graves were, and Bucha aren't the only mass graves in Ukraine. We've seen them everywhere that the Ukrainians have liberated has uncovered fresh horrors. The Russians were murdering, executing, brutalizing Ukrainian civilians at an industrial rate. There was 38 days of occupation in Bucha, 38 days, and they pulled more than 400 bodies out of there.
Did you interview any of the locals that survived? What did they say?
They reported that the Russians beat them, that the Russians killed people.
Why were they lucky to stay alive then, and their neighbors weren't? Why do you think?
That's something you'd probably have to ask them, to be honest with you. I think a lot of other journalists did more of the post-Bucha aftermath stuff a lot better than I did. I was there in the immediate aftermath. So the majority of my coverage was based on there's bodies here, there's graves here, there's this here, there's that here. Whereas the really, really intensive, traumatizing work happened in the weeks afterwards, where journalists spent weeks walking around interviewing people. That's a really long process. I didn't do that. After the end, I'll be honest, like after those 4 or 5 weeks of war, I'd been working 16 hours basically every day. I had run my body into the ground at that point. So I ended up with 3 back-to-back infections that happened basically shortly after we got back from Bucha. I got an infection in my hand, and I got a throat infection. So I was really, really sick. I was like basically bedbound for about 2 weeks. And after that, I just made the decision that I promised that I would stay in Kyiv until it was liberated. Kyiv was totally liberated. I made the decision to go home and recover and rest. I really needed it. I was mentally, physically, emotionally drained after that. And again, I didn't fight anything. I was just covering it, and that's the impact that it had on my body. So I didn't do all of the kind of long form work. So many journalists did incredible work there.
Yeah, the reason why I'm so interested, it's 2-part. One is you have the documentary about it, so I'd like to get more insight, firsthand, insight. Second is, I used to live not too far from there. I used to live in Kotsubinski, which is very close to Irpin. And my doctor's office was in Bucha. I was there because I had surgery, so I was at a hospital in Bucha for a while. I had appendicitis, so I had to take care of that. And then also when I wanted to submit some documents or get some documents for my propiska or my tax ID, I would go to Irpin and submit documents. So I'm familiar with these areas. And I left, right before, the invasion. So it kind of hits close to home. And, hearing stuff like this, it's so tragic, man.
Yeah, I mean, look, I will say, when you watch the documentary, you will see that there are locals that I speak to that are interviewed, and their testimony is haunting. It's horrifying. We did do some of that work, but I didn't do to get the real stories from, you need to do a lot. You need to do days and days and days of on the ground research and work in a longer form, and that just didn't fit with the work that I was doing. And
Yeah.
so I think that those stories really needed to be told, and unfortunately, I wasn't the person that told them. My perspective was more like a macro view of what happened in Kyiv in its totality. It puts into context what the stakes were, what the risks were, what the costs were. And it tells that story from an on the ground perspective. Unfortunately, because it tells it from those people and through their eyes, it can't then tell the story of what happened to the people as they survived the horrors of Bucha and Irpin. But as I said, my film is really sad. You watch it and you will be very upset by the end, because in the beginning it's quite chaotic. We don't know what's going on. I'm mostly locked in my apartment, so I don't get out there as much as I want to. But as the days progressed, you start seeing the horror in the film as I'm seeing it. So the film is told in chronological order, which really sets the tone for what we're seeing. And because it's told in that order, it ends in Bucha and Irpin and the aftermath of Bucha and Irpin. So that hits you hard, because you don't know what's happening, what the Russians are doing, until right at the end. And then it's all laid bare, the horrors of what they did, the war crimes that they committed. So
you've been here for 3 years now.
Yeah.
You've seen the Russians retreat areas. You've seen Russians, gain land in certain areas. And with the current political climate right now, it's not looking so good for Ukraine. Are you optimistic about the future of the country?
I've been trying a lot recently to not get in a dooming cycle about what's happening, about the Trump administration, about the losses that Ukraine has made on the battlefield, because I don't know that perspective is helpful for analysis, but most of all because I don't want to make things more difficult for Ukrainians who are fighting and dying and suffering day in, day out. No, I'm not optimistic. No, I'm not hopeful. I think that the Trump administration is currently, as we're speaking, in the process of betraying Ukraine. However, I have seen in Ukrainians the kind of defiance and steadfastness and spirit and resolve that I think that Ukraine will survive this. I don't know how and to what extent and on what timeline. I just think Ukrainians have survived Hitler and they've survived Stalin. They will survive Putin and Trump. Trump is going to betray Ukraine, and the Europeans are going to have to step up to do that. The Russians are going to try and take more land, and if there's any kind of cessation of hostilities, I believe the Russians will rearm and invade again. I don't believe that all hope is lost for Ukraine because of Trump. I don't believe that. Because no matter what Trump wants, it's just not something he can get. He can't say, Ukraine, you need to surrender now. And the Ukrainians are going to go, okay, yes, sir. That's not going to happen. And if that doesn't happen, what are the prospects for this war's future? It's not going to be good. It's going to be really difficult for the Ukrainians. They're going to be forced to fight alone for a long period of time. The Russians are going to be given concessions, I believe, by the Americans, that this will strengthen Russia's hand. I think a lot of people are convinced that we're heading towards some kind of conclusion, maybe not a permanent conclusion, but at least a temporary cessation of hostilities that Trump will try and paint it out as both sides claiming some sort of win. I think the Russians are determined to not just conquer Ukraine all of Ukraine, but to completely remake the security architecture of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that this is just the starting point for many years of struggle. And
So this is like an existential crisis for Europe, right?
for Europe, yeah, obviously it's existential for Ukraine, but it's existential for Europe. It's also existential for Russia. The Russians can't afford to lose now. If Russia loses this war, Russia collapses. I have no doubt about that. I also think that's why some European nation states and even the Biden administration at the time were kind of more worried by Russia collapsing than they were by, Russia winning some kind of stalemate.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, look, I do think this is an existential matter, and that's why I hold both positions, that I'm not hopeful for the future, but also that I don't think that some sort of cataclysmic defeat is on the cards for Ukraine in the immediate term.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Ukrainians aren't going to surrender. They're not going to, and the Russians are getting something you said earlier, that we believed at the time that Russia was the second largest, strongest army in the world. Russia was the second largest, strongest army in the world.
Mm-hmm.
That was true. The Ukrainians effectively defeated the second largest army in the world in Kyiv without ATACMS, without, jet fighters, without artillery shells. They did this all on their own, right? With a few anti-tank weapons and just Ukrainian spirit and defiance. To defeat Europe, Russia has to go through Ukraine. And this is what makes me so angry at the moment, is Ukrainians are not fighting and dying just for Ukraine's future, just for the future of Ukrainian democracy. They're fighting and dying for our freedom, for the freedom so our children don't have to fight another war in Europe in 10, 15 years' time. That's what Ukrainians are dying for. And the failure of us in the West to realize that and give Ukraine the support that it needs will come back to haunt us in the future. Hopefully, that's not going to happen. Hopefully, Europe can step up to try and prevent this from happening. I think the discussions around putting European troops in Ukraine are very encouraging at the moment. But still, that ultimately looks like it requires some sort of territorial concessions on the Ukrainian part. And anything that gives Russia a victory will only result in Russia aiming for more in the future. And I really think that European leaders need to wake up to that now, that any kind of appeasement made, any kind of Munich deal made with the Russians will only result in the further invasion of Ukraine, and potentially invasions of the Baltic states and Europe. There are serious people who say this is alarmist. Russia failed in Ukraine. How can it? Russia failed in Ukraine as it currently stands. But if we hand them a victory, then they won't have failed in Ukraine, and they will be emboldened to go further. And it's absurd to me that people are talking as if this could never happen, when it's quite clearly in Putin's interest to make this happen. And one of the key pillars of that is NATO. They don't have to fight a war against all of NATO. All Russia has to do is make it so that NATO Article 5 isn't respected or adhered to. Do you really think Donald Trump is going to go to war with Russia if Russia invades Estonia? Do you think that? I don't think that. I think Putin will abandon NATO Article 5. Trump will abandon NATO Article 5 if he sees an opportunity to.
He's already talking about pulling out of NATO. So
look, the thing is, as important as America is to the post-war liberal order and so on and so forth, the European Union is a powerful, powerful bloc. It has the power and might to enforce real red lines on Russia. And it needs to step up to the plate, because the Americans are descending into their own fascist oligarchy. I don't use those words lightly. I think America is on track to become a fascist oligarchy. Donald Trump tried to do a coup d'etat. He failed at a putsch, and instead of going to prison for that, as he should have been for life, for treason, he was rewarded with the presidency. So I think we're in a the most dangerous period since the Second World War. And I think that if Europe doesn't meet the challenge today, that Russia is absolutely going to go further. So this really is existential for us now.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you, and I wish we had more time to talk about this further, man. And I just to close it off, and I feel very embarrassed to be an American right now because this is not who we are. This is who we become, but this is not who we are.
Look,
who we were, and
I respect that. I respect Americans. I really do. But I think the thing that you may need to start accepting, not you personally, you as Americans, is that this may be who you are. I know that's not nice to hear, but the Germans needed to hear in 1945 that is who they were. Russians today need to hear that is who they are. Americans now need to hear the same thing. It's no use patting yourselves on the back and saying, we're not like this. They don't speak for us, because they do. Metaphorically and literally, the Trump administration speaks for America. And right now they're trying to impose costs on Ukraine greater than was imposed on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. And Germany and Ukraine is not the aggressor. Russia's being rewarded for its aggression, and Ukraine is being punished for its defense by the world's only superpower. That's happening as we're recording this current conversation. And Americans can't afford to tell themselves that at the end of the day, this isn't who we are, we're better than this, because what matters now is resisting these efforts. And you can't resist these efforts if you're busy telling yourselves, don't worry, it's only another 3 and a bit years and it will all be over, and then we'll revert to some sort of normal. There might not be a new normal. This might be the new normal. And that requires serious work from Americans. And the first step to that is acknowledging that you have a problem. Not you, again, not you personally, but Americans. You have a problem with fascism. And if you don't resist it, no one else can.
No, I totally agree with you, man. And in the end, I'm just embarrassed. Like, this is all embarrassing. It's sickening. But anyway, so we reached the end of our time. I'll tell you what, if people want to follow you, I know you have a big following on Twitter and all this. I refuse to call it X, Twitter. If you want people to maybe follow your journey, or if you want to give information about your upcoming documentary, feel free to look into this camera and just plug away.
So my film, The Battle for Kiev, my documentary comes out later this year. It tells the story of the opening weeks of the war in Ukraine, told from a boots on the ground perspective. And I hope you watch it. I hope you can see firsthand what the Russians did to the Ukrainian people, and just how incredible the Ukrainian bravery and resistance was. If you want to follow me and follow my reporting, you can find me at Oz Katerji, my full name, no spaces, on basically all platforms with the same handle. Yeah, please, if you ever have any questions, please feel free to send me them as well. I'm always happy to answer anything that I can, even though I may be quite busy covering the collapse of the American empire in the 21st century.
Well, thanks for coming on, Oz. And yeah, I just feel like you kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things, and I feel like I have to do like some soul searching now as American. Yeah, it's really enlightening. So thanks for that.
No worries. Yeah, we didn't get the chance to talk about Syria, unfortunately, but maybe another time I'd be happy to come on.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, I'd love to have you back on. But yeah, I'm going to sign off right now. So thanks again, guys, for watching this episode of Expats in Ukraine with your host, me, Corey. If you like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more episodes like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you want to ask Oz a question, feel free to comment down below. You're going to read the comments, right?
Sure.
Yeah, and honestly, to you guys, I want to say, yeah, after talking with Oz, I'm doing some soul searching as an American, and I feel utterly embarrassed. And Americans do have to take responsibility, just like Oz said. So thanks for that. And yeah, at the end of the episode, I like to shake the hand of the guest over here. Sure. So thanks for coming out. Great chat.